So we know that the government may place a tariff on a good for a whole variety of different reasons, and this diagram explains the impact of that tariff. So if we see the situation prior to the tariff being introduced, we can see that a domestic supply curve here, and we have our domestic demand curve. Now, the one assumption we do make is that globally supplied goods here are done at an identical price, so this leads to the perfectly elastic supply curve. Now, the initial situation is that domestic producers will supply up until the point of Q1. This is because this supply curve is below the price of the world price, which is here. So it is cheaper to buy from domestic suppliers up until Q1. Now at Q1, the domestic price rises above that of the world price, so we will switch to buying from the world suppliers, and this will continue all the way up until it meets the demand curve here, giving us Q2. So the initial situation is domestic suppliers will supply up until Q1, and then foreign suppliers will supply up until Q2. Now, a tariff is then placed on the world price, and the tariff is equal to this amount here, which pushes the price up to PW plus T. Excuse the formatting here, I'm not sure quite what happens. But we now then get a higher price and this new supply curve here. Now, similar theory to before, but of course slightly different numbers. So we can see now then domestic suppliers will supply the market up until Q3. So at Q3, the domestic supply price rises above that of the world price. So domestic suppliers produce 0 to Q3, and then we will import between Q3 and then again up until a new equilibrium is reached with the associated value of Q4. This diagram shows the impact of the elasticity of demand upon the imposition of the tariff. So we can see here with a relatively inelastic demand curve, the quantity demanded will fall, but by a relatively small amount, whereas where the domestic demand is relatively elastic, we can see the impact is greater as the quantity will fall to QE as opposed to QI. We need to answer the question, who gains and who loses from this imposition of the tariff? But we do this purely from the perspective of the UK, so ignoring any gains or losses from foreign suppliers, etc. So in this diagram here, we can see the consumer surplus that took place before, that was earned before the tariff was imposed. So just a reminder, the consumer surplus is the difference between the price that the consumer has to pay, which is this equilibrium price here, and the price that they're willing to pay, in other words, their demand curve. So for each consumer, we can see this is the difference between what they were prepared to pay and what they actually had to pay. So this is the consumer surplus that was in place prior to the tariff. Now, once the tariff is put in place, we can see this consumer surplus actually falls. So consumer surplus is now only this triangle here. And that's the equivalent of the loss of this yellow area I'm highlighting at the moment. So we can see the imposition of the tariff has led to a decline in the consumer surplus for UK consumers. Now, UK producers, on the other hand, gain from this. So originally, UK suppliers were only supplying Q1 of the marketplace. However, after the tariff, we can see that they're now supplying Q3 to the market. So producer surplus, in the same way, I suppose the equivalent to consumer surplus is, it's the difference between the price that producers were willing to sell for and the price that they actually sell for. So this is the price they received prior to the tariff, and this is the price they were willing to sell for. So after the increase in price and after the imposition of the tariff, we see that this area here is the gain in producer surplus. The government also gains from the imposition of the tariff because they receive money in the form of taxation from the tariff. Now, the amount of money they receive is the quantity of imports, and we can see the quantity of imports is, as we discussed earlier on, between Q3 and Q4 multiplied by the value of the tariff. So it's this here. So this box here represents the revenue from the tariff that the government receives. This slide gives quite a neat summary of the changes as a result of the tariff. So we can see here we can see the loss of consumer surplus, whereas here we can see the gains in producer surplus and the gain in government revenue. So in order to calculate the net effect for the UK, we can see in this area here that 1 is 2 and 3 and 4 are all a loss of consumer surplus. Now area 1 is cancelled out due to the rise in producer surplus, and area 3 is cancelled out due to the rise in government revenue due to the tariffs. So the net effect is a loss of areas 2 and then areas 4 due to the imposition of the tariff.